Hi, today we're going to be looking at natural selection in action, which follows on from our video on evolution. So we'll think about the actual mechanism of natural selection, which we kind of talked through last time, and also some of the implications this has for the human population. So natural selection, what is this? Well, it's the idea that we start off with variation. There are natural differences across a population. For example, here are some rabbits, and some of them have white fur and some of them have brown fur. Now, they might all be competing for the same resources, food and mate, or competing to avoid from predators. Obviously, in this environment, the brown rabbits are less well adapted to survive in that environment. If you've got a lynx, for example, it can easily see the rabbits with brown fur, and they're more likely to be seen and be eaten. To spare your sensibilities, that brutal massacre has been censored, but the brown rabbits have been killed. The white rabbits survive. The successful white rabbit genes are passed on to the next generation. The brown rabbit, unfortunately, does not pass its genes on to the next generation. So as long as the environment stays the same, you'll get more and more and more white rabbits gradually being produced, and fewer and fewer brown rabbits as those genes get eliminated from the population. Last time we set you a short exercise. Here's the answers to that. The idea being that individuals produce diverse offspring. They compete for different things. The offspring with the most competitive traits survive and reproduce at the expense of the offspring with fewer of those competitive traits. They die or they don't get a chance to reproduce. So the frequency of that particular trait that we're interested in increases in the population. So for things to be able to be passed on, there needs to be variation in a population, even if it's very small and subtle. The differences need to be inheritable. You need to be able to inherit that difference. You need to be able to pass it on to the next generation. So not like scarring, that can't work. And there must be some kind of means of selection, something that is choosing that particular characteristic at the expense of others. Let's look at another one. Here is an example of frogs, and this snake that eats particular amphibians, and it's ended up with smaller heads. Why is it ended up with smaller heads? The cane toad. The cane toad is extremely toxic and large. Anything that eats it gets poisoned. So, tree snakes feed on cane toads. They have no poison resistance. The snakes that feed on cane toads die. This puts what we call a selection pressure on the cane toad population. Don't say cane toads, on the snake population. It favours the snakes that don't eat cane toads, and the ones that don't eat cane toads are the ones which have smaller heads because their heads are too small to eat the toad. So therefore, if they have a small head, they can't eat the toad, and therefore they don't get poisoned, and therefore they survive to breed. So it's a selective advantage having a small head. So small-headed snakes have a greater chance of surviving to breed, and they pass on that small-headed sort of idea allele to the next generation. So selection pressure. Now, really you need to be aware of selection pressures, the idea that it can determine which trait is successful, the idea that there is pressure on the selection. The trait should have a normal distribution, but if there is a particular selection pressure, that can affect whether or not there is still a normal distribution. So for example, you can end up with disruptive selection, ending up with what you call two modes. Yeah, in other words, something with at the bottom end of a range and something at the top end of a range are easily able to survive. Things we don't have that on average characteristic don't survive. You can get a stabilizing selection. Increasingly, more and more individuals become more and more similar. Human height is doing this, for example. Yeah, we are becoming a population where we are rapidly all becoming the same sort of height as we all gradually get better access to food and better access to medical care. And there can be directional selection. So in other words, we skew towards a particular extreme. For example, if there's a sudden and rapid change in the environment, you might end up with directional selection. Okay, let's play Spot the Organism. Can you spot the living organism here? If you look very carefully, you will see that here is a peppered moth. It's a pale-coloured speckled moth. And there are two particular allele forms of this. Here's the dark form. It's slightly more obvious, but much better lit. It's still fairly camouflaged against the dark background. And here's a comparison of the two different types. Dark one on a light background, it's going to easily be seen. Lighter one, less easily to be seen. So this one is more likely to be seen and more likely to be eaten. Humanity provides a strong selection pressure. For example, antibiotics, and the use of antibiotics is selecting for a particular bacteria. If anything that can survive a particular antibiotic after a couple of generations will divide and produce what we call a resistant population. So MRSA, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, is an example of an antibiotic resistant bacteria. It's resistant to most particular antibiotics that we've now used. And this has some implications. Let's just think about how that might have happened. So before you get the selection, you have a range of different characteristics for a particular across the population. For example, different levels of resistance. After use of the application of an antibiotic, the ones which are least resistant are killed, and leaving behind the ones which have some resistance. And then the final population end up all being derived from those, so they all have some resistance. Their offspring have resistance. Only the ones which have low resistance are selected against. This can happen with pesticides too. Pesticides, chemicals that kill pests such as insects, but there are plenty of other examples. If you apply the pesticide to crops to prevent the pest from eating the crop, or from causing damage to the crop, or causing diseases to the crop, or if you're trying to kill insects like mosquitoes that would otherwise transmit malaria to humans. Very current with the idea of the Zika virus at the moment, which is also being transmitted by mosquitoes. The idea that insecticides can be used, but if they're not, it soon develops selection. Again, you get this idea of this. The pesticide is the selection pressure in this case. Before you apply the pesticide, you've got few things which are resistant. After the pesticide, you get the individuals surviving that are resistant until most of the population is resistant. And this can happen in as little as a couple of years. It doesn't take long for organisms to be able to survive. You've only got to have a few individuals that survive to breed and something with a rapid life cycle. You soon get a population which is then made up of large numbers of the individuals which are resistant. You end up with this idea of almost an arms race. Farmers apply higher doses of insecticides to try and get rid of a particular pest, but that just selects even more and even more. You can also end up with unwanted side effects. DDT, a particular insecticide that was applied a lot in the sort of early part of the 20th century until it was discovered that actually it built up in larger predatory organisms. And that's because as each organism eats something next in the chain, the amount of DDT gets further and further concentrated until you end up with things at the top of the food chain or the food pyramid ending up with lots of DDT concentrated in them. Concern for us because we are large predators that eat other organisms that will therefore end up with large amounts of DDT concentrated in them. So not a good idea. Okay, exam question time. Here's an exam question. It says celery plants produce chemical signals when attacked by herbivorous insects. The signals switch on the plant's resistance genes with a code for insecticides. Suggest why celery produces insecticides only when attacked by insects, and then outline the steps by which resistance to an insecticide may arise and spread in an insect population. Okay, have a go at this, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.